Hello and welcome to this special afternoon briefing with the Jerusalem Press Club. I am Jonathan Beck, Director of Content. With us today is Avi Hasson, Head of Startup Nation Central, a non-governmental organization that is helping Israeli tech companies achieve funding and find angel investors, etc., and also revealing them to the world so that investors can find them. On this busy news day, just as the Houthis yesterday fired a missile at Israel, which was intercepted, and following the attacks in Yemen, we almost forget that last week an Israeli company, Wiz, has been announced to have been acquired by Google for the outstanding sum of $23 billion, which is the highest ever sum paid for an Israeli company. So we can use that bit of good news as a segue to presenting our guest today, Avi Hasson, Head of Startup Nation Central. Hello, Avi, and thank you for joining.
Hello, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
SNC published its half-yearly report last week on Wednesday. And of course, this report begins, I think, in January, covering the first 6 months of the year, to which Israel entered 2 months into a war which has been one of the hardest in its history. I would say that back then predictions about the economy were more dire than what the report actually presents. Is this so?
Yeah, that's actually true. So let's just jump right inside to the data. So as you say, so first of all, maybe just a quick word about who we are to put things in context, because we've been monitoring that data as part of our operation for over 10 years. So Startup Nation Central, an NGO, 100 people based in Tel Aviv. Our work is really to strengthen Israel's economic engine, the high-tech and innovation ecosystem, mostly by connecting between global players, multinational companies, investors, governments, solution seekers, to the solutions providers within the ecosystem. As part of that, we have our platform called Finder. Think about a PitchBook, Crunchbase of Israel. So about 9,000 companies there, investors, startups, everything is searchable. By the way, like all of our offerings, this is free of charge. So I really invite all our participants to log in and look at that report that we'll be talking about, as well as really a variety of data on companies, including the ability to connect to specific companies. So that's a bit about who we are. Now, when we look at the data, really summarizing the first 6 months, which actually were all of them months of war in Israel, we were positively surprised. I have to say that if you would have asked me to guess or anticipate what would be that number, I would probably not have guessed that we will see a surge of over 30% in the money raised by Israeli startups compared to the previous 6 months, the second half of 2023. Remembering, by the way, that everywhere throughout the world, there's been a massive decline compared to the peak level of 2021 and 2022, mostly because of high interest rate and the economic downturn. Israel has its own, local or Israel-specific issues to deal with. And obviously, since October 7th, it was the war. With 10% of the high-tech workforce that have been enlisted to active reserve duty, with the uncertainty that war brings, and just the practical challenges of investors coming to Israel and so on, one would have expected to see a decline or maybe a flat picture. And the numbers we've seen tell a different picture. So just start mentioning some numbers. In the first 6 months of 2024, Israeli startups raised over $5.1 billion. That's in over 320 different rounds, really representing, the attractiveness, I would say, of Israeli startups to global investors. A similar picture we've seen in the M&As, mergers and acquisitions. You mentioned, of course, the notable example of Google and Wiz, a deal that still has to get the regulatory approval and hasn't been closed yet, and in any case, is not part of our report since it was just came out. But there were many, many other deals of acquirers like Nvidia, Zscaler, Palo Alto Network, and a bunch of others, SAP with a $1.5 billion acquisition, again, showing the attractiveness of what Israeli technology and talent can offer to the global leaders.
Okay. Can I ask you about rating agencies downgraded Israel's economy 4 months ago, 5 months ago? A few rating agencies, one after the other, either announced the risk of downgrading the rating or actually have done it. Has this been a deterrent to tech investors? Has this been, on the opposite, something that pulled tech investors because companies are now valued lower? What was the effect of this, basically?
Well, I would say the following. First of all, and again, let's separate for a minute the public market and the private market. So when it comes to private investment, obviously, by the way, all the credit rating agencies stop right at this office every quarter. They visit us, they hear our perspective, and it actually being compiled into their reports. And I'm sure that for some investors, it made them more hesitant about their willingness or desire to invest in Israel, or maybe saying, not right now, and let's wait to see what's happening. But again, what the data shows us is that was even more investors. Some of them we can name because they publicly talked about that. So we're seeing leading venture capital firms like Sequoia and Greylock reopening their office in Israel and doubling down on Israel, simply because, and this is their words, not mine, unlike 2021, where things were crazy, or in broader language, more competitive and pricey, the opportunities that now exist on the ground, combined with the very strong fundamentals of Israel, make this ecosystem very attractive. On the growth and scale up private equity, we see people like Blackstone, by the way, also an investor in Wiz, so I'm sure that will turn out very well for them if the deal goes through. General Atlantic and many others, which again are echoing that message of what they see in Israel and the fact that it's still unique and attractive compared to others. Now, as part of our report, and again, I'm inviting everybody to dive in, we've created our own index of about 120 Israeli companies traded on NASDAQ, trying to compare it to the NASDAQ EW, equal weight index, and really trying to see how these two work together. And what we're seeing, and now I'm directly touching your question, is that at the time of the publishing of those reports, you actually see the Israeli discount kicking in. So the performance of Israeli companies is dropping down compared to their peer group, but very quickly, within a matter of a few weeks, it gets back to the trend line of the overall NASDAQ. So the answer would be short-term impact on the public performance. But if you look at that trend line, and again, it's all there in our report, you see a remarkable similarity in what happens with the Israeli and the overall technology performance, both in the private funding as well as in the public markets.
Can you say how unusual this is? I mean, we have a recent example. We have Ukraine, which is a modern country relatively, with the tech industry, with programmers, with coders, etc. And they also are in the middle of a war. Is the picture there different compared to Israel? Like, considering that...
But to be fair, these are two very different economies. I mean, we haven't started with the overall introduction, but just making sure our listeners are aware. So high tech is 20% of Israel's GDP. 20%. That's the highest in the world. That's a super high number. Again, if we just want some comparable, oil and gas for Russia is 16%. High tech for the US is about 9%. High tech for the EU is about 6%. So this is our economy. I mean, our economy is based on this ecosystem. And when you rank the Israeli ecosystem compared to its peers, you really see the importance of Israel to the global venture capital and multinational companies, right? And if we just look into, I'm not going to mention all of them, but just some example of things that happened during the war by multinational companies. So Intel decides to invest additional $25 billion in building yet another fab, manufacturing foundry, semiconductor manufacturing plant in Israel. Nvidia spends over $1 billion acquiring 2 AI companies in Israel and launches their AI developers supercomputer in Israel during the war, 2 months ahead of schedule. Google, of course, with the example that you just talked about, with Wiz, and many, many others, right? SAP, which I mentioned before. So I think the importance of the Israeli innovation ecosystem to the global multinational companies and to the global investors is truly is unparalleled by any other country. It's not the only place where innovation happens. There are many, many countries all over the world where startups exist and innovation takes place. But as a mature and sophisticated ecosystem, certainly when you think about the tech giants, there are very few places that are equally important to Israel, and that's why the Ukraine comparable is is somewhat problematic. The only comparable, which I can tell you again, just quoting those companies, they were amazed by the fact that when the Russia-Ukraine war started out, the first concern of all the companies, by the way, including the Israeli companies, which had about 20,000 Ukrainians working for them, was how do we take the teams out of the country? How do we make sure, whereas in Israel, we saw 300,000 people hopping on a plane and coming to Israel. So very different in that aspect. The resilience, if I need to choose one word, by the way, to really symbolize what the high tech has shown since October 7th, it will be resilience. The overall output, and we mentioned funding, but it's not the only parameter. There's obviously also revenues and performance of larger companies. The output has been impacted in a very, very small degree. And in some sectors, it even grew.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I ask you, I mean, there is an arm of the government, which is the Israel Innovation Authority, which not only headed, but actually founded some years ago. Can you speak about the role of the IAIA in this war and what they did in the beginning and whether it was crucial or not, etc.?
Yeah, so I have to say, and it's not as if I would say sing high praises for everything the government has been doing since the war, but when it comes to agency and this specific agenda, we've actually seen very quick response, very positive measures taken by the Israel Innovation Authority. So very few weeks after the war, they came up with $100 million emergency funding fast track designed to solve the problems of the very early stage companies, which, let's say, were in the middle of a round of financing and have been confronted with cash flow problems. If you're a CEO of a startup, and that's where I spent most of my life, having 12 months of runway is a typical day at the office. And all of a sudden, when the war started out, there was a lot of uncertainty, and the government said, we're going to put into the market that emergency funding as bridge funding to make sure that those companies weather the storm. And without getting too technical, those $100 million actually brought with them $150 million more of private sector funding. So altogether, there were about $250 million injected into the market, really to solve. We didn't want to lose good companies simply because of the war. And that was, I think, a very, very important signal, but also a very important measure taken by the Israel Innovation Authority, in addition to other policy measures that have been taken by them to make sure that the high tech, as I've said, weather the storm and becomes even stronger. Because one has to say, and we didn't touch that point yet, there's a big difference and discrepancy between different sectors within the high tech if we look on the past 6 months. And cybersecurity, a prime example of a super, super strong sector, both in terms of raising money, M&As, and so on. But other sectors like agri-food tech, like health, have been struggling. There are sectors that by definition are more capital intensive and have a longer horizon and higher risk. And therefore, we've seen investor more hesitant there. And there, the government money was very, very much important and instrumental to help those companies, get to the other side of the war.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Mr. Hasson. Can I ask a final question? Are you willing to predict how the next 6 months will look for the tech industry in Israel? I mean, of course, I'm not going to ask for predictions about the war because we don't know where it's going. But Is this a trajectory we're expecting to continue?
So obviously we don't know. I mean, I have the daily data. That's I don't have to wait for our report because we see data on a daily basis. I will say the following: by far, what we've seen, and by the way, this is not only when we look on the past 6 months. If we look in the past 20 years, by far, and I'm talking about 90% plus, the performance of the Israeli tech sector is defined and impacted by the performance of the global tech sector. So you know, the most important part of your question is, what do we predict for the global tech sector? Now, that, again, is part of a bigger economic cycle. I'll say the following: high interest rate do not favor tech investment and venture capital investment, right? There are alternative, lower risk asset classes, and that was the main reason, by the way, for the decline we've seen globally. Obviously, war is not good for business. While I do expect, and we're already seeing that, we haven't touched that yet, but we're seeing an emergence of technologies that actually are partially impacted by the war, from direct defense tech or dual-use technologies, but also sometimes, you know, agri-tech solutions based on drones, or medical devices solutions based, again, on technologies, or by the way, mental health and rehabilitation sectors that unfortunately, you know, have been built. But if we put that aside, by far we're impacted by what's happening in the world. By looking from the public market performance and looking at the trends, we can be cautiously optimistic, but a lot will depend on the base scenarios. So I wouldn't, you know, go on and recommend on buying or selling stocks or participating in the private market as such.
Okay, thank you. But you still, you know, you still consider the factors affecting our tech economy external to Israel, and not, you know, not this war or this.
Yeah, by far, again, war obviously carries its toll in many aspects, but by far, if we look all the way to October 7th, and certainly the 6 months, we're seeing the robustness of the sector, really, and the ability to continue. And by the way, unfortunately, I mean, we haven't, thank God, we haven't never experienced anything like this, but we've had our share of crises, from previous rounds of conflicts to COVID, the subprime crisis, the bubble burst. I still remember. I was an active player then. And Israel high tech always showed, compared to its peer, not just agility, but also the ability to quickly recover and really get back to a growth you know, trajectory very, very quickly. So, while again, the growth of the sector, not of funding, in the past 6 months have been slower than what we've seen in previous year, it's still been quite robust.
Okay, thank you very much for this insightful briefing, Mr. Hasson. Let's hope, you know, these good news keep coming, as opposed to news from project heads coming from elsewhere in the world. And I hope we'll be in touch for the next report to present it.
Yeah, and again, I do invite, you know, all of our listeners, going to the Startup Nation Finder. I think it can be a useful tool for anyone seeking you know, connections, trends analysis, looking at sectors, a lot of data. There's never a paywall, so there's never going to be a charge for anything you consume there. And I can tell you that, you know, hundreds of thousands, mostly global users, use that every day.
Okay, thank you very much. I would also like to thank Ali at here at the Jerusalem Press Club for producing this, and Esti for making the connection with you at SNC. And this briefing will be available on our YouTube channel within a few hours. Just a reminder to our viewers that from the beginning of August, these briefings will be available to JPC members only. Thank you very much.
Thank you.